I think it's pretty clear that the New Testament writers, the apostles, understood this psalm to be ultimately about Jesus and the salvation that he accomplished. I say that in part because the writer of Hebrews quotes this psalm, verse 22, in his explanation of how Jesus becomes our perfect Savior. And there you see it quoted. I'll give you the entire context. Verse 10, it's fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, and bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. So Jesus became our perfect Savior through suffering. Verse 14, it reminds us that since therefore the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself, Jesus, likewise partook of the same things, and through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For it's not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. So not just the incarnation, but even his suffering. He had to suffer like human beings suffer, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. That's atonement. Because he himself has suffered when tempted, when tried, when enduring trauma, he is able to help those who are being tempted, those who are suffering. So the writer of Hebrews makes the case that Jesus is a perfect Savior because he suffered with us. God knows exactly what it feels like, in an existential sense of that word, to suffer. God is suffering with us. He has not abandoned us. He is, in fact, completely with us. So this is great news. Not only that we're saved through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, through what the Bible calls propitiation, but we're saved in a very practical, real way through the suffering of Jesus, through the knowledge that God suffers with us, that God knows exactly what we are going through. So you might ask, how is David's opening question answered? Why have you forsaken me? Why? Why is there suffering? That big question of theodicy. Well, it is this fact that God's glory is revealed in suffering. You might recall in John 9, the question is asked of a blind man, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind, that he suffers from blindness? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the glory of God might be revealed. God is glorified through suffering. And we see this image throughout the Scriptures, that the wilderness precedes the promised land. There is a season of suffering before glory. And we see Jesus himself acting this out, living this out in the cross. Suffering preceded glory. I think this psalm helps us answer one of the most pressing questions that humans ask, and that is the problem of suffering. How can you believe in a God who is good and who is all-powerful and yet allows suffering to happen? And so many philosophies and religions have been developed to try to deal with this. In Hinduism, the problem of suffering is simply postponed through reincarnation. The concept is that you accept the suffering that you have in this life in the hope that in future lives you will have less suffering. And so the idea is to work your way up the caste system to be a better person so that in your next life you will not suffer as much, and suffering will be diminished. So that's the Hindu hope. Buddhism teaches us to deny suffering, sort of deny, the material world, and embrace, live in a spiritual realm that sort of accepts. Suffering is part of the material world, but you try to live in a higher plane, a different place, a spiritual plane. Atheism. Their solution to the problem of suffering is simply to avoid it, to medicate yourself, to try to pursue pleasure and avoid pain at whatever cost. So the atheists will tend to medicate their pain with sex, with drugs, or with nihilism. But in Christianity, we have God redeeming suffering, God taking our suffering and making something of it, glorifying himself through it. We also have the reality that God suffers with us, that God experiences our pain not just in a distant philosophical way, but in a very real way. And we know this because Jesus experienced the pain on the cross. Now, you may ask yourself, Jesus is God in the flesh. How in 6 hours on a Friday afternoon can he experience the fullness of human suffering through millennia of time and billions of people? How can one person in 6 hours take on and experience that level of suffering? Let me suggest this analogy that might help us with that. Think of an insect. Say, for example, last summer we were catching fireflies in our backyard, and in the process, of course, of catching fireflies, there's some carnage. There's some fireflies that don't make it. And I had a group of people over that were doing this, and the question came up, does a firefly suffer? And I suppose there might be a minimal amount. I don't know. I just don't know how much pain a firefly experiences, but I know they are not sentient beings. I know they don't have any kind of level of awareness that human beings have, and so their suffering is certainly a much lower order than ours. But when a human being experiences pain and death, there's grief, there is deep sorrow. There's a greater loss over the death of a human being, certainly, than over an insect, because a higher order of being experiences a higher order of suffering. So God, of course, is the highest order of being. Therefore, it goes to follow that he would also experience a higher order of suffering. He is an infinitely higher order of being than you and I. So that means he is capable of experiencing an infinitely higher order of suffering as well. So here's the resource that the Christian faith offers when you are suffering. You can be confident that God knows exactly how you are feeling, that he has been there, that he has felt lonely, he has been abandoned, he has experienced physical, psychological, social pain of a degree that we can't even begin to comprehend. And he is with us. That's what Emmanuel means, God with us. This Hebrews passage is incredibly powerful. The simple statement that Jesus was made perfect through suffering. He became our perfect Savior. And so I believe that as Jesus was hanging on the cross, it's very likely that in his final thoughts, the final words that went through his mind as he looked out at the humanity that was gathered there at the foot of the cross, I think he was able to look beyond that, and he could see a great feast. He could see the ends of the earth, the families of the nations worshiping. He could see rich and poor feasting at the wedding feast of the Lamb for all eternity. He could end his suffering on the cross with this incredible hope and certainty that his suffering would bring about salvation. And in fact, we can look at the history of the church in the early centuries and note the remarkable growth of the church. Following the death of its founder, the church takes off and grows until within 3 centuries it has, in effect, overturned the Roman Empire. The very empire that ordered the crucifixion of Jesus was ultimately upended by the movement that Jesus started. Yes, Jesus was made perfect through suffering. The lesson for us, I think, is there in verse 24, that God hasn't despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. No, he embraced it. He picked it up. He took it upon himself. He has not hidden his face. He has heard when he cried. If you ever need proof that God is with you, just take a look at the cross. God doesn't choose to eliminate suffering in this life. Rather, he gives us something better. He gives us the resources to endure it, namely his presence in the midst of it. If we ever doubt his presence when we are suffering, all we have to do is look to the cross.